Please, save him." The desperate whisper of an 8-year-old girl pierced the freezing silence of Christmas Eve. Shivering uncontrollably, she unzipped her thin jacket, sacrificing her own warmth to save the tiny, dying puppy cradled in her arms. That heartbreaking sight stopped Ethan, a broken veteran wandering the blizzard to escape the haunting ghosts of war. In that snowy park, two lonely souls found each other, bonded by a helpless animal that would become their miraculous bridge to healing. This is a story of profound redemption and the true meaning of life. Hit subscribe now to witness this emotional journey. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the city in a suffocating white blanket on Christmas Eve, and in the deserted park the silence was absolute, heavy, and cold, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on ice. Ethan moved through this frozen wasteland like a ghost haunting the edges of a world he no longer understood, a solitary figure seeking refuge in the biting wind to escape the suffocating warmth of holiday cheer. He was 35 years old, a man carved from granite and regret, his physical presence commanding and formidable even in the emptiness of the night. Standing at 6'2" with broad shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight, he possessed a square, chiseled jawline that was currently set in a permanent grimace of stoicism. His dark brown hair was cut in a disciplined military style, side-parted and neat despite the weather, while his face, clean-shaven but for the heavy shadow of stubble darkening his cheeks, bore the rugged texture of a man who had spent years exposed to the harshest elements. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray-blue, scanned the perimeter with a sharpness that belonged to a combat zone, not a civilian park. The corners etched with worry lines that deepened whenever the silence grew too loud in his head. He was dressed in a full U.S. Navy Type 3 digital woodland camouflage uniform, a sartorial choice that defied the logic of the holiday season but served as a necessary armor for his fractured soul. The familiar weight of the tactical fabric, the rough texture of the collar against his neck, and the U.S. flag patch on his shoulder were the only things holding his shattered pieces together. He was a former Navy SEAL, a warrior who had returned home with his body intact but his mind scattered across foreign deserts, haunted by the echoing screams of battle and the faces of brothers who hadn't made it back. Tonight, the joyous carols drifting from distant houses felt like shrapnel to him, triggering a suffocating panic that drove him out here where the freezing temperature matched the hollowness in his chest, his breath pluming in the air like smoke from a dying fire. He stopped abruptly, his coyote-brown combat boots sinking into a fresh drift of snow as the silence of the night was pierced by a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It wasn't the mechanical hum of the distant city or the cracking of frozen branches. It was organic, a raw vibration of distress that pricked at his heightened senses. His head snapped toward a dilapidated wooden bench illuminated by a flickering, dying street lamp that cast a sickly blue hue over the snow. The noise came again, a high-pitched, desperate whimper followed by a soft, soothing hush that sounded heartbreakingly human. Ethan approached, his movement fluid and predatory, a muscle memory from years of stalking targets, until the shape resolved into a tragedy that made his breath catch in his throat. Huddled beneath the bench was a child, a little girl, no older than 8, her presence a shock of fragility against the brutal elements. Her hair was a tangled mess of wind-blown knots, framing a face that was dangerously pale, her lips trembling and turning a terrifying shade of violet. She was named Lily, though he didn't know it yet, and she possessed a fierce determination that seemed too large for her small, shivering frame. She wore a jacket 2 sizes too small and far too thin for a blizzard, the fabric threadbare and insufficient, but instead of pulling it tight to preserve her own heat, she had it unzipped, her chest exposed to the biting wind. Nestled against her heart, wrapped inside her meager warmth and shielded by her own body, was a German shepherd puppy, barely 6 weeks old. The creature was a ball of black and tan fluff, its tiny body trembling violently as it let out another pitiable cry, its wet nose buried deep in the girl's sweater as if trying to merge with her heartbeat. "It's okay. Shh, I've got you," the girl whispered, her teeth chattering so hard the words were chopped into fragments, her voice a thin ribbon of sound in the gale. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror as Ethan's shadow fell over her, blocking out the dim light. To her, he must have looked like a giant, a menacing soldier looming out of the storm with intense eyes and a grim expression. But Ethan felt his heart hammer against his ribs, not with adrenaline, but with a sudden crushing wave of empathy that cracked the ice around his soul. He dropped to one knee, the wet snow soaking instantly into the knees of his tactical pants, ignoring the cold that bit at his skin. The contrast was stark and painful. The battle-hardened SEAL, trained to kill and endure the impossible, kneeling before a child fighting a silent war of survival with nothing but love. "I'm not going to hurt you," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse, sounding like gravel grinding together, yet laden with a surprising gentleness. He saw the way she clutched the puppy, prioritizing the animal's life over her own freezing body, exposing herself to the elements to save a creature even more helpless than she was, and something ancient and protective roared to life within him, silencing the ghosts of his past. He didn't ask where her parents were. The abandonment was written in the snow gathering on her shoulders and the hollowness of the park. Without a word, he began to strip off his heavy tactical jacket, the Velcro patches tearing with a loud rip that made the puppy flinch. "You're freezing," he stated, a command rather than an observation, his hands moving with efficient speed. He draped the heavy, warm uniform jacket over both of them, the thick fabric swallowing her small form, instantly shielding her and the dog from the biting wind, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt a mission objective clear in his mind: keep them alive. The transition from the biting frost of the park to the interior of Ethan's battered 1990 Ford pickup truck was a journey from one world to another, the heavy door slamming shut with a metallic finality that sealed out the howling wind. Ethan had carried Lily and the puppy in one fluid motion, his strength immense and unwavering, depositing them onto the cracked leather of the passenger seat like precious cargo salvaged from a shipwreck. He climbed into the driver's side, the dashboard lights casting a dim, greenish glow over his sharp features, highlighting the stoic tension in his jaw as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, a rough, guttural beast that matched its owner, and he cranked the heater to the maximum setting, the vents blasting hot, dry air that smelled faintly of dust and old oil. As the truck navigated the treacherous, winding roads leading out of the city and up towards the ridge, Ethan remained silent, his gloved hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the whiteout conditions ahead with the hypervigilance of a man who expects an ambush around every corner. Beside him, Lily was a statue of awe and exhaustion, her small hands buried in the thick digital woodland camouflage of his jacket, which draped over her like a tent, while Scout, the tiny German shepherd, poked his head out from the oversized collar, his black button eyes watching Ethan with a curious, unblinking gaze. They arrived at the cabin 20 minutes later, a structure that looked less like a home and more like a defensive outpost carved from the mountain itself. It was built of rough-hewn cedar logs that had darkened with age, perched precariously on a granite ledge overlooking the valley, isolated by a dense perimeter of snow-laden pine trees that stood like sentries in the dark. Ethan killed the engine and carried them inside, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind him with his boot. The interior was Spartan and masculine, dominated by the scent of raw pine resin, wood smoke, and gun oil. A massive stone fireplace took up one entire wall, the embers from a previous fire still glowing a dull, menacing red in the gloom. Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, depositing Lily on the oversized leather armchair before kneeling before the hearth to stoke the fire. Within seconds, flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows that softened the hard planes of his face, momentarily chasing away the cold, gray look of the battlefield from his eyes. He turned back to the girl, his demeanor shifting from driver to medic. "Jacket off," he ordered gently, his voice low and rumbling. "I need to check for frostbite." Lily hesitated, clutching Scout tighter, but the warmth in Ethan's eyes, hidden beneath the steel blue intensity, reassured her. She let the heavy uniform coat slide down, revealing her trembling frame. Ethan's movements were clinical yet tender, his large, callous hands checking her fingers and toes with the precision of a field medic assessing a wounded comrade. He pressed on her fingernail beds, counting the seconds for the color to return, checking capillary refill, and nodded in satisfaction when the pink hue rushed back quickly. "Circulation is good," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He then turned his attention to Scout. The puppy was shivering less now, its belly full of the warmth from the truck ride. Ethan lifted the small creature, his hand engulfing the dog's entire torso. He checked the puppy's paws, looking for ice balls between the pads, and felt the rhythm of its tiny, rapid heart. It was then that the connection happened, a spark in the quiet room. Scout, who had been wary, suddenly leaned forward and licked the rough stubble on Ethan's cheek with a wet sandpaper tongue. Ethan froze. The sensation was shocking in its innocence, a stark contrast to the violence and grit that usually defined his physical interactions. He looked into the puppy's eyes, dark, trusting, and devoid of judgment, and felt a wall inside him crumble just a fraction. This tiny life didn't see a broken soldier or a weapon of war. It saw safety. It saw a pack leader. "He likes you," Lily whispered, her voice rasping slightly from the cold, a small tentative smile breaking through her fear. Ethan cleared his throat, looking away to hide the sudden moisture in his eyes, and set the dog down gently on the rug. "He's a survivor," Ethan grunted, masking his emotion with gruffness. He moved to the small kitchenette, the floorboards creaking under his combat boots. He found a tin of cocoa powder and a carton of milk, his actions automatic as he heated the liquid on a small propane stove since the power lines were likely down from the storm. The smell of chocolate soon mingled with the wood smoke, a scent of domesticity that felt alien in this bachelor's fortress. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 chipped enamel mugs and brought them over, handing one to Lily. "Drink. Slowly," he instructed, watching as she wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. He found a shallow bowl, poured a little warm milk into it, and placed it on the floor for Scout. The puppy attacked the milk with clumsy enthusiasm, its tail wagging a tiny, frantic rhythm that thumped against the floorboards. Ethan sat back on his heels, resting his forearms on his thighs, still clad in his tactical pants and boots, the firelight catching the U.S. Navy patch on his discarded jacket. He watched them, the girl sipping her cocoa with wide, grateful eyes, and the puppy lapping up milk with abandon. They were intruders in his carefully constructed solitude, breaches in his perimeter. Yet, as the wind howled impotently outside the thick log walls, Ethan realized the silence in his head had changed. It was no longer the screaming void of PTSD. It was a quiet, watchful peace. He wasn't just a man hiding on a hill anymore. He was a sentry on watch, and for the first time in a long time, the mission wasn't to destroy, but to preserve. The cabin, once a tomb for his memories, had transformed into a fortress of warmth, holding back the winter night for 2 small souls who had nowhere else to go. The fire in the hearth had settled into a steady, hypnotic rhythm, the logs cracking and shifting with sharp pops that punctuated the heavy silence of the cabin, casting long dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls that seemed to lean in to listen. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the lingering sweetness of cocoa, a sharp contrast to the sterile, freezing void Ethan had just pulled them from. Lily sat curled in the oversized armchair, her small frame almost swallowed by the leather, her legs tucked beneath her as the warmth slowly returned color to her porcelain cheeks, turning the deadly violet hue of her lips back to a soft, natural pink. She held the empty mug with both hands as if it were a talisman, her gaze fixed on the flames, while Scout, the German Shepherd puppy, lay sprawled across her lap, his tiny belly rising and falling in the deep, twitching sleep of the exhausted. Ethan stood by the mantelpiece, one arm resting on the rough wood his silhouette imposing against the firelight, still clad in his digital woodland camouflage trousers and coyote brown boots, the top of his thermal shirt outlining the tension that never seemed to leave his shoulders. He watched them with a guarded intensity, waiting, knowing that trauma often needed silence before it could find a voice. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice small but surprisingly steady, piercing the quiet room. "My mom is a nurse," she said softly, not looking up from the fire. "She works the night shift at St. Jude's. She wears blue scrubs that smell like peppermint and clean sheets." Ethan didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, encouraging her to continue. Lily took a shaky breath, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking the soft fur behind Scout's ears. "She promised," Lily whispered, a tremor entering her voice. "She promised that if she got off early, we would go to the park to see the big tree and the lights. She said, 'Wait for me by the bench, Lily Bug. I'll be there at 6 o'clock sharp.' She never breaks a promise. Never." The clock on the cabin wall ticked loudly. It was now past midnight. Lily looked up at Ethan then, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, revealing a terrified intelligence. "I waited. The snow started, and people left. But I waited because Mom doesn't lie. Then I heard a noise near the trash cans." She looked down at the puppy. Someone put him in a box, a wet cardboard box. He was crying. She had found the puppy abandoned, shivering in the refuse of the holiday celebration, and in that moment of shared helplessness, she had made a choice. She couldn't leave him to freeze, just as she couldn't leave the bench in case her mother appeared. So she had stayed, becoming a guardian while waiting for her own. "I thought maybe the storm slowed her down," Lily choked out, a single tear escaping and tracking through the soot on her cheek. "But she would have called. She would have come." Ethan looked away from the girl's devastating gaze and focused on the puppy. Scout was dreaming, his paws making little running motions in the air, a low whimper escaping his throat. The sight hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow, triggering a memory he kept locked behind high walls. He was back in the belly of a transport plane, the air reeking of jet fuel and sweat. Beside him sat Bravo, a Belgian Malinois with a coat like burnished copper and eyes that held a frighteningly human intelligence. Bravo had been his other half, a weapon and a brother wrapped in fur and muscle, who had moved with the silent lethality of a shadow. He remembered the weight of Bravo's head on his knee before a drop, the absolute trust in the animal's posture, the way they communicated without words in the chaos of a firefight. Bravo hadn't made it back from their last deployment. An IED in a dusty, God-forsaken village had severed that bond, leaving Ethan with a phantom limb where his soul used to be. Looking at Scout, this tiny, helpless echo of the warrior dog he once knew, Ethan felt the old grief stir, but it was different now. It wasn't just pain. It was recognition. He saw the potential in the puppy's loyal cling to the girl, the same fierce devotion that had defined Bravo. Ethan turned back to Lily, his expression shifting. The hard lines of his face softened, not into pity, but into a grim resolve. He pieced the intel together with the cold logic of a strategist. A reliable mother, a nurse trained to be responsible, a promise kept even in hardship, a sudden blizzard, and a total no-show. This wasn't abandonment. The realization settled in his gut like a stone. Women who worked double shifts to feed their kids and promised to see Christmas lights didn't leave their daughters to freeze on park benches. "She didn't leave you, Lily," Ethan said, his voice low and firm, cutting through the crackling of the fire. He walked over and crouched in front of her, forcing her to look him in the eye. "If she promised, she meant to be there. The storm." He trailed off, his mind racing through the geography of the city, the road from the hospital to the park, the treacherous curves that iced over first. He looked at the window, where the wind was still battering the glass, though with less fury than before. "Something stopped her," he said, not to scare the child, but to validate her faith. "And we are going to find out what." For the first time that night, Lily didn't look like a victim. She looked like a girl who had just been given permission to hope. Ethan stood up, his hand brushing the dog tags beneath his shirt. The rescue mission hadn't ended at the park. It had only just begun. The engine of the old Ford pickup roared to life for the second time that night, the sound a defiant growl against the howling wind that battered the wooden walls of the cabin. Ethan didn't hesitate. The decision had been made in the silence of the room, forged by a soldier's calculation that waiting for official help in a blizzard this severe was a death sentence. The police scanners were likely jammed with calls about downed power lines and fender benders, and by the time a patrol car could make it up the ridge, the trail would be buried under another foot of snow. He ushered Lily and Scout back into the truck, ensuring the girl was buckled tight and the puppy was swaddled securely in a spare wool blanket he kept behind the seat. As he climbed into the driver's side, the interior light illuminated his face, casting deep shadows into the hollows of his cheeks and highlighting the grim determination set in his square jaw. He was still wearing his full U.S. Navy Type 23 digital woodland camouflage uniform, the green and tan pixelated pattern seeming to blend into the chaotic shadows of the night, while his combat boots, heavy and caked with fresh snow, worked the pedals with precise, controlled movements. His gray-blue eyes, usually clouded with the fog of trauma, were now clear and terrifyingly focused, scanning the windshield with the predatory intensity of a hunter tracking prey through a jungle, only this jungle was made of asphalt and ice. Ethan steered the truck down the winding access road, the tires crunching heavily as they fought for traction on the slick surface. His plan was simple but relied on a skill set few possessed. He would backtrack the route from the park to St. Jude's Hospital, looking for what they called in the teams anomalies, disruptions in the natural pattern of the environment. The world outside was a disorienting tunnel of white, the headlights cutting only a few feet into the swirling vortex of snow, but Ethan drove with a calm that unnerved the darkness. He knew this terrain. He knew the topography of the county, the way the roads dipped and curved around the foothills. Beside him, Lily was silent, her small hands gripping the dashboard, her face pale but her eyes fixed on the road, mirroring his intensity. She wasn't crying anymore. She was waiting. Scout, the tiny German shepherd, was restless in her lap, his ears twitching, his black nose working overtime as he sniffed the stale air of the cabin, occasionally letting out a low, vibrating whine that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the engine. They passed the outskirts of the town, where the streetlights were nothing more than hazy orange orbs in the sky. Ethan slowed the vehicle as they approached a stretch of road known locally as Dead Man's Curve, a notorious switchback that hugged the side of a steep ravine, bordered only by a rusted steel guardrail and a dense thicket of pine trees. "Keep your eyes on the tree line, Lily," Ethan instructed, his voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Look for anything dark, anything that doesn't look like a tree." He wasn't looking for a car, the snow would have covered a vehicle by now. He was looking for broken branches, a gap in the white wall of the embankment, or the glint of metal where it shouldn't be. The truck crawled forward at 5 miles per hour. The wiper blades slapped rhythmically against the glass, a metronome counting down the seconds of hope. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the cab shifted violently. Scout, who had been merely restless, erupted into a frenzy. The puppy scrambled up from Lily's lap, his claws scrabbling against the vinyl dashboard, and threw himself at the passenger side window. He barked, a high, sharp, piercing sound that was too big for his small chest, and clawed frantically at the glass, his eyes wide and fixed on a specific point in the darkness outside. "Scout, stop!" Lily cried out, trying to pull him back, but the dog was possessed, his hackles raised, his tail rigid. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt in the middle of the empty road. He didn't scold the dog. He knew better. In the teams, they trusted the K9s with their lives because the dogs could sense what human senses missed. Smell, vibration, the electromagnetic shift of fear. "Stay here," Ethan commanded, his hand already reaching for the heavy-duty tactical flashlight clipped to his belt. He shoved the door open and stepped out into the gale. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stinging his freshly shaven face, but he didn't flinch. He clicked the light on, the beam cutting a blinding white sword through the storm. He walked toward the spot Scout had been barking at, his boots finding purchase on the ice. At first glance, it looked like just another snowbank. But Ethan crouched low, his eyes narrowing. There, barely visible under a fresh layer of powder, was a discrepancy. The perfect, undulating line of the snowdrift was broken. He brushed the snow away with a gloved hand and felt the jagged edge of torn metal. The guardrail was gone, severed. He shone the light further down, past the edge of the road, into the abyss of the ravine. The beam caught the broken limbs of a pine tree, snapped freshly and smelling of sap, and further down, about 50 feet into the dark, a faint, unnatural reflection glinted back at him. It was a tail light, red plastic half buried in white. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with confirmation. The dog had been right. The soldier had been right. The promise hadn't been broken. It had been crashed off the side of a mountain. He turned back to the truck where Lily's face was pressed against the glass and gave a single, sharp nod. They had found her. Stay here. Lock the doors and cover your eyes if the light scares you, Ethan commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument, though his hand lingered for a split second on the door handle, his gaze locking with Lily's terrified eyes. He didn't wait for an answer, slamming the truck door shut and effectively sealing the girl and the puppy inside the warm, vibrating cabin of the Ford, isolating them from the violence of the storm. He turned to the edge of the road where the guardrail had been sheared off, the jagged metal teeth protruding from the snow like the ribs of a prehistoric beast, and without a moment's hesitation, he plunged over the side. The ravine was a nightmare of verticality and ice, a 60-degree slope of frozen mud and shattered granite hidden beneath 2 feet of fresh powder. Ethan didn't slide. He descended with controlled chaos, his coyote-brown tactical boots digging into the earth, his gloved hands grasping at exposed roots and pine branches that whipped against his face, tearing at his skin. The beam of his tactical flashlight cut a frantic arc through the swirling white darkness, illuminating the path of destruction the car had carved. A trail of snapped saplings and churned earth that led 50 yards down into the belly of the gorge. The wind here was a physical entity, roaring through the funnel of the ravine, trying to tear him from the mountainside. But Ethan moved with the relentless, grim efficiency of a machine, his mind shutting out the cold, shutting out the pain in his old injuries, focusing entirely on the objective. At the bottom, wedged precariously between 2 massive ancient oaks that had arrested its slide into the creek below, lay the vehicle. It was a silver sedan, crumpled like a discarded soda can, resting on its side with the driver's door facing the sky. The smell of gasoline was pungent and terrifying, cutting through the crisp scent of pine and snow, a ticking time bomb in the freezing air. Ethan slid the last 10 feet, his boots slamming into the side of the wreck. He scrambled up the undercarriage, the metal groaning under his weight, and shone his light through the shattered spiderweb of the driver's side window. Inside, suspended by her seatbelt in a gravity-defying tableau of violence, was Sarah. She appeared to be in her early 30s, her face pale as moonlight, framed by hair the color of wheat that hung loose and matted with blood from a gash on her temple. She was wearing seal blue medical scrubs, just as Lily had described, the thin fabric entirely inadequate for the temperature of the shattered cabin. Her head lolled forward, chin resting on her chest, and her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath the crushed dashboard, trapped by the crumpled metal. "Sarah!" Ethan roared, banging his fist against the glass, but she didn't stir. He needed to breach, and he needed to do it now. He pulled his tactical knife from the sheath on his vest, the heavy steel pommel, glinting in the light. With a sharp, powerful strike, he shattered the remaining safety glass, clearing the jagged shards with a sweep of his gloved arm. He dropped inside the cabin, his large frame filling the cramped, inverted space. He checked her pulse first, carotid artery, strong but thready. She was alive. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "I've got you, I've got you," he muttered, a mantra for himself as much as for her. He sliced through the seatbelt, bracing her weight with his shoulder so she wouldn't drop, and then turned his attention to her leg. It was pinned, not crushed, thank God. He used his immense strength, bracing his back against the roof and pushing the steering column with his legs, groaning as his muscles screamed in protest, bending the metal just enough, an inch, 2 inches, until her leg slid free. She moaned then, a low sound of agony that didn't wake her but signaled the pain deep in her nervous system. Ethan didn't apologize. He worked faster. He couldn't stabilize the leg here. The gas fumes were getting stronger. He had to extract. Getting her out of the car was a puzzle of leverage and brute force, but getting her up the ravine was a war. Ethan hoisted Sarah onto his back, securing her arms over his shoulders in a fireman's carry, her unconscious weight a dead load that threatened to topple him with every step. He began the ascent. It was a grueling, hellish climb. The snow gave way under his boots, sending him sliding back inches for every foot he gained. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps that tasted of copper. The wind tried to push them back down, but Ethan anchored himself with a fury born of desperation. He wasn't climbing for a mission. He wasn't climbing for the Navy. He was climbing for the little girl pressing her nose against the glass at the top of the hill. Every time his strength faltered, he thought of Lily's eyes, of the promise she believed in, and he forced his legs to piston downward, driving them upward. He dug his fingers into the frozen mud until his nails bled inside his gloves. He was the only thing standing between this woman and death, the only link between a mother and her child, and he would not break. When his hand finally slapped the asphalt of the road, he didn't stop. He dragged himself over the edge, gasping, his lungs on fire, and collapsed to his knees on the flat surface, Sarah safe on his back. The headlights of his truck washed over them, a holy light in the darkness. He looked up to see Lily's small face in the window, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt not like a soldier, but like a savior. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world that was blindingly white and terrifyingly silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of melting icicles from the eaves of the cedar cabin. Sunlight, sharp and brilliant, poured through the frost-rimmed windows, cutting through the gloom of the previous night and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stillness of the room. Sarah drifted back to consciousness slowly, emerging from a heavy, pain-filled darkness into the smell of wood smoke and something surprisingly domestic, brewing coffee. She blinked, her vision blurring before sharpening on the wooden beams of the ceiling. She was lying on a plush leather sofa, her body covered by a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and masculine soap. A dull throb pulsed in her left leg, and when she shifted, a sharp intake of breath hissed through her teeth. She looked down to see her leg expertly immobilized, splinted with what looked like pieces of smooth firewood and wrapped tightly with clean white gauze, a professional field dressing that spoke of training far beyond basic first aid. Panic flared in her chest for a heartbeat. Where was she? Where was Lily? Before her eyes swept the room and landed on a tableau that made the breath catch in her throat, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. Across the room, in a massive armchair that faced the dying embers of the fireplace, slept the man who had pulled her from the abyss. Ethan looked different in the morning light, though he still wore the same digital woodland camouflage pants and the thermal shirt that hugged his broad chest, his tactical boots finely unlaced and sitting by the hearth. The tension that had defined his silhouette in the storm was gone, replaced by a momentary peace that softened the harsh, chiseled lines of his square jaw and the heavy shadow of stubble that darkened his cheeks. He looked younger, less like a weapon of war and more like a weary guardian at rest. But it was what lay upon him that made Sarah's eyes sting. Curled up directly on the center of his chest, rising and falling with his deep, steady breaths, was the tiny German Shepherd puppy. Scout was fast asleep, his black nose tucked under a paw, looking absurdly small against the vastness of the soldier. And there, on the rug beside the chair, wrapped in Ethan's oversized camo jacket like a cocoon, was Lily. Her daughter was sleeping soundly, one hand reaching out to touch the toe of Ethan's sock, a subconscious tether to safety. They looked like a painting of a family, disparate pieces thrown together by chaos, finding a strange, geometric harmony in the quiet. Sarah tried to sit up, the leather creaking beneath her. Instantly, Ethan's eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no disorientation. 1 second he was asleep, and the next, those piercing gray-blue eyes were locked on her, alert and clear. He didn't jump. He just froze, assessing the threat level before relaxing. He placed a large hand gently over the sleeping puppy to keep it steady, then shifted his gaze to her. "Easy," he rumbled, his voice gravelly with sleep but quiet enough not to wake the children. "Your leg is stable, but don't put weight on it. Tibia fracture, hairline, I think. You're lucky." He carefully lifted Scout, who let out a squeaky yawn and flopped onto the cushion and stood up, moving with a stiffness that hinted at his own bruises from the climb. He walked over to her, looming tall and capable, yet keeping his distance to avoid frightening her. "I'm Ethan," he said simply. Sarah looked up at him, seeing past the military bearing to the exhaustion in his eyes. "I remember," she whispered, her voice cracking. You climbed down. You carried me." She looked at Lily, tears welling in her blue eyes. "You saved us all." "I made breakfast," Ethan said abruptly, deflecting the gratitude that clearly made him uncomfortable. He turned to the kitchenette, where a cast-iron skillet sat on a propane burner. He plated scrambled eggs and toast with the efficiency of a man used to rationing motion, bringing the food to her. As the smell of eggs and bacon filled the room, Lily stirred. The little girl sat up, rubbing her eyes, her hair a bird's nest of tangles. "Mommy?" she croaked. The reunion was quiet and tearful, a fierce hug that bridged the gap of the terrifying night. Ethan stood by the window, sipping black coffee, watching them with a guarded expression. For years, Christmas morning had been the enemy, a reminder of empty chairs and silence, a day he usually spent staring at the bottom of a bottle or hiking until his lungs burned in the freezing air just to feel something other than numbness. But today, the cabin wasn't empty. It was filled with the sounds of forks scraping plates, of Lily whispering to her mother, of the fire crackling. Suddenly, a commotion broke the solemnity. Scout, having smelled the bacon, decided to launch an offensive. The puppy scrambled across the floor, paws sliding on the polished wood, and tripped over his own oversized ears, tumbling snout first into Ethan's boot. He let out a startled yip and shook his head, looking indignant. Lily giggled, a bright bell-like sound that seemed to shatter the last remnants of the gloom. Sarah smiled, her face lighting up despite the pain. And then, something miraculous happened. Ethan looked down at the clumsy ball of fur attacking his shoelaces, and the corner of his mouth twitched. A low, rusty sound escaped his throat. A chuckle. It was a foreign sound, unused and dry, but it was there. He reached down and scratched the puppy behind the ears. "At ease, soldier," he murmured. He looked up and caught Sarah watching him. In that exchange of glances, there was no need for words. The ghosts that usually screamed in Ethan's head on this day were silent, drowned out by the presence of this accidental family. He realized, with a start that shook him more than the adrenaline of the rescue, that he didn't want them to leave. The wound in his chest, the one no shrapnel had caused, felt like it was finally beginning to stitch itself closed. 3 days later, the sun finally reclaimed the mountain, turning the blinding white expanse of the valley into a glittering landscape of thawing ice and dripping pine boughs. The county plows had roared through at dawn, their heavy steel blades scraping against the asphalt, carving a path through the snowdrifts and effectively reconnecting Ethan's isolated fortress with the rest of the world. The sound, mechanical and grinding, signaled the end of the sanctuary. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the heavy, suffocating silence of impending departure. Sarah, whose leg was now stabilized with a more permanent brace Ethan had fashioned from medical supplies he kept in his tactical kit, sat on the edge of the sofa, folding the few clothes she had. Her face, though still pale from the ordeal, had regained a certain steeliness, the look of a woman who was used to picking up the pieces and moving forward. She wore a clean flannel shirt Ethan had lent her, which swallowed her slender frame, making her look fragile yet determined. Lily stood by the door, her small hand buried deep in the fur of the German Shepherd puppy. Scout, now visibly stronger and fuller after days of warmth and regular milk, sensed the shift in the air. He didn't frolic this morning. Instead, he sat pressing his weight against the girl's shins, whining low in his throat. Ethan stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, staring into the dying embers. He was dressed in his standard attire, the digital woodland camouflage pants tucked into his coyote-brown combat boots, his broad shoulders filling out a black thermal tactical shirt that accentuated the powerful muscles of his back. His square jaw was set hard, a tick jumping in his cheek, his gray-blue eyes clouded with a storm that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He heard the zip of a jacket, the rustle of a bag. It was the sound of his life returning to what it was before, empty, silent, and cold. Lily's voice broke the stillness, small and trembling. "Mom says we can't take him," she whispered, looking down at Scout. "Our apartment. The landlord said no pets. He said he'd evict us if he saw even a goldfish." She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around the puppy's neck, burying her face in his fur. "You have to be a good boy for Mr. Ethan, okay? You have to keep him safe like you kept me safe." The words hit Ethan like shrapnel. He turned slowly, watching the scene. He saw the heartbreak in the girl's eyes, a resignation to loss that no child should have to learn so young. He looked at Sarah, who was watching her daughter with a look of helpless devastation, the reality of their poverty and circumstances crashing down on the magic of the last few days. Ethan looked down at Scout. The puppy looked back at him, then licked a tear from Lily's cheek. In that moment, the soldier in Ethan analyzed the tactical situation. He saw two civilians returning to a hostile environment, a cramped apartment, financial struggle, loneliness. He saw himself remaining in a fortified position that had no strategic value without something to protect. He remembered the plans he had drawn up years ago, before the last deployment, before the PTSD hollowed him out. He had bought this land, hundreds of acres of forest, with the intention of building a retreat, a series of cabins for veterans or families who needed to escape the noise. The blueprints were still rolling around in the back of his truck, yellowing and forgotten. He had the land. He had the money from his service. What he lacked was the will. But looking at Lily, looking at the way Sarah had organized his chaotic kitchen in 2 days on a broken leg, he realized he didn't lack the will anymore. He just needed a squad. "Leave the bag, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice rough, cutting through the room like a command. Sarah froze, looking up at him in confusion. Ethan took a step forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He didn't fidget. He stood at attention, as if delivering a briefing. "I have 5 guest cabins on the lower ridge. They're shells right now. Roofs are on, but they need interiors. I bought this place to turn it into a retreat, a resort, something quiet." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck, a rare sign of vulnerability. "I never finished it. I didn't have a reason to." He looked directly at Sarah, his gray eyes locking with hers, intense and sincere. "I can't run a place like that alone. I'm not good with people. I need a manager, someone to handle the logistics, the bookings, the organization." He gestured vaguely to the kitchen she had cleaned. "And I need a caretaker for the K9 unit." He pointed at Scout. "The guest house behind this cabin is fully furnished. 2 bedrooms, fenced yard, no landlord to tell you what you can or can't keep." Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open, processing the offer. It wasn't charity, The set of his jaw told her that. It was a trade, a partnership. "Ethan," she stammered, "you're offering us a home? A job?" Ethan nodded once, sharp and decisive. "I'm offering a new post. The pay is competitive. Start immediately." He looked down at Lily, whose eyes had gone wide as saucers. "And the dog stays with the caretaker. That's the rule." A silence stretched for a heartbeat, and then Lily shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, and threw herself not at the dog, but at Ethan's legs, hugging his knees with all her might. Ethan stiffened for a second, then his large hand came down to rest awkwardly but gently on her head. Sarah stood up, balancing on her good leg, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "we accept the mission." An hour later, Ethan stood on the porch of the cabin. The air was crisp and clean. Below, near the truck, Sarah and Lily were moving their few belongings into the guest cottage visible through the trees. Smoke was already curling from its chimney. Scout sat at Ethan's left heel, sitting at attention just like Bravo used to, his ears pricked forward watching the girl. Ethan took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold mountain air. The heaviness in his chest was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since he left the teams. He wasn't just a broken man hiding on a hill anymore. He was a provider, a protector. He looked down at the puppy. "Looks like we've got a perimeter to hold, Scout," he murmured. The dog looked up and barked once, sharp and clear. Ethan smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, and looked out over the valley. The winter was ending, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready for the spring.